Recently, I have been having a series of short lectures on the concept of research critique. In the previous four short lectures, I have had an introduction to the concept of research critique, and then we have discussed the research critique of generally the first four chapters of a research thesis or a research report. The chapter 1 or introduction, the chapter 2 or literature review, the chapter 3 or methodology, and the chapter 4 that is data analysis and interpretation. This particular presentation is aimed at the concept of research critique for the conclusion chapter or chapter 5 of a research thesis. So as I have discussed this, research critique is generally an integral part of research as a scientific method of knowledge. And it is an appraisal of the aims, the processes, and outcomes of a research undertaking. The focus of research critique generally is on evaluating the research process and product and identifying its possible strengths and weaknesses. And the aim of it is actually to add to the value of research theses, reports, and papers by identifying their shortcomings and also strengths, and helping the research students or researchers in general to review their theses and research reports and to improve those. So chapter 5 or the conclusion part of the research thesis or research report has certain sections. Generally, these are important sections that are included in chapter 5 or conclusion chapter. The introduction, generally the brief summary of the whole research report or research project, the main findings, discussion, conclusions, recommendations or implications in some cases, and limitations and suggestions for further studies. So now, what are the important questions that the research critic have in their minds when they are reviewing, when they are critically looking at, or when they are doing a critique of the research thesis or research reports? So the first one is related to the introduction part of it. So does the chapter 5 or the conclusion chapter have a succinct introduction? Secondly, a summary. Is there a summary of the main components or process of the study? This summary generally begins with a recall of the topic, a restatement of the topic at this stage, the aims of the research questions and hypotheses, a little background, a short summary of the methodology, and a general conclusion. So this is something that is presented as a summary in the beginning of chapter 5. So the research critic will look at the presence of this summary over there, the existence of this summary, and plus the quality of it. Then the main findings and results. So generally, it is expected that in good quality research thesis, there is a summary of findings towards the end in qualitative studies, and if they are quantitative or experimental studies, so generally they are termed as results. So the questions that the critic will ask at this stage is there a summary or list of the main findings or results of the study available at the end in this chapter? And secondly, is the summary or list of main findings or results in line with the research objectives, research questions, and hypotheses? So it is important that the researcher makes a link between the the findings towards the end of the research project and their objectives or research questions and hypotheses. So if there is this link is missing, that will be a reflective of a weak research design or a weak link between the aims of the research and then the conclusions or ends of the research. And then in many cases, in some cases, the discussion is a part that is included in Chapter 4, where there is data analysis and interpretation. But in some cases, discussion could also be included after the findings or results section, the summary of findings or results section at Chapter 5. So that is also something that the research critic will look at. So it is important that the researcher has not just included their findings or results, but also there is a critical discussion on the related to those results or those findings, which is actually a reflective of a critical analysis on the part of the researcher and their understanding of the findings. And then the next thing is, in the next section, is the conclusion section. So here the research critique will ask questions such as, does the chapter have a conclusion? So first of all, does the chapter have a conclusion section, which is very important in Chapter 5 generally, and that is actually towards the end of the research thesis. And also, is the conclusion section based on the findings or results of the study? Or is there an element of overgeneralization or claims beyond the scope of the findings and results? So it is important to get good reports from research critics and thesis reviewers or research paper reviewers that the conclusion or conclusions that are drawn towards the end of the research are actually based on our findings and results. In many cases, junior researchers, student researchers make this mistake that they overgeneralize or they go beyond the scope of their findings and they make claims that are actually not reflected in their finding section. So it is important that to avoid this discrepancy between what they have really found and what they are claiming for or concluding from those findings. And then the recommendations or implication sections, generally in quantitative researches with positivistic paradigms, the term recommendations is used, but in more qualitative type of studies, the term implications is generally used. So does the chapter have a recommendations and implications section? And secondly, are recommendations or implication based on the result findings and the results of the studies? So again, the researcher needs to make sure that they are recommending things or steps that are actually reflected and that have a strong base in their findings. So again, there should not be a general type of recommendations that go beyond the empirical findings of the study. Also, in many cases, it is a requirement that the researchers should include a limitation section where they are actually acknowledging the possible weaknesses, either in terms of the conception of the research or in terms of the research design or the implementation of the research design. So possible weaknesses or loopholes, indicating those is actually reflective of authenticity on the part of the researcher, and so good research reports should have these. And so research critique will generally ask questions related to the indication or inclusion of limitation section in Chapter 5. And lastly, researchers are also expected to give suggestions for further studies in order to help other researchers or readers who are reading these reports to get ideas for to explore the topic further in different ways or in different geographical locations or with different samples and with different research designs. So this is also an important section. And so good research critique will also ask questions related to the, first of all, the inclusion of this section of suggestions for further studies, but also the viability of this kind of inclusion related to suggestions for further studies. So these are important sections of Chapter 5 about which the research critic will ask questions in their research critique.